On the night of September 23rd, 1938, 7 men walked into the Lennox Club on 145th Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem and made a decision that would turn the next 12 hours into what newspapers would later call the most violent night in Harlem's history. They weren't armed, at least not visibly. They didn't start a fight. They did something far more dangerous in the carefully calibrated world of 1930s organized crime. They laughed at Bumpy Johnson. The Lennox Club was what people in Harlem called a policy bank, a front for the numbers racket that operated in plain sight, protected by payoffs to the right police officers and maintained by the absolute rule of reputation. The main room held about 80 people that Friday night. Jazz played from a phonograph in the corner. The smell of tobacco smoke and bootleg whiskey hung thick in the air. At a corner table sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 32 years old, dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than most Harlem residents made in a month. With him were 4 men: Illinois Gordon, his primary enforcer; Junie Bird, a numbers runner who controlled 6 blocks of the racket; Nat Pettigrew, recently released from Sing Sing and already back in the organization; and Freddie Moore, a strategist who'd worked with Stephanie St. Clair before she semi-retired from active operations. The 7 men who entered were Irish. Their leader was Mickey Hogan, a lieutenant in the Dutch Schultz organization, or what was left of it after Schultz's murder 3 years earlier in 1935. With Hogan came Patrick Red Doyle, Tommy Flanagan, James Corrigan, Eddie Sullivan, Mickey's younger brother Sean Hogan, and a man known only as Brooklyn, whose real name remains unknown even in police records. They didn't need to announce themselves. Everyone in the club knew who they were the moment they walked through the door. Hogan approached Johnson's table directly, weaving between other patrons who suddenly found reasons to move away. He stopped 3 feet from Johnson's chair, smiled, and spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Bumpy Johnson," he said with mock formality. "The king of Harlem. The big man." He paused, letting the smile widen. "Except you're not so big anymore, are you? You're sitting in a club that used to belong to Schultz. You're collecting on corners that used to be ours. You think because you got some black folks scared because you know some Italian names that you run this neighborhood?" Johnson didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Hogan with the same expression a scientist might use while examining an insect. "Word is," Hogan continued, "you've been telling people that Harlem belongs to Harlem now, that the white gangs are finished here, that you're the new power." He laughed, and his 6 companions joined in. "You're a policy runner with delusions, Bumpy. You're a black man in a white man's game, and you don't have the muscle to back up what you claim." Then Hogan did something that, according to 14 witness statements collected by the NYPD over the following week, sealed what happened next. He reached over, picked up Johnson's glass of whiskey, drank it, and slammed the empty glass back down on the table. "That's what I think of your power," Hogan said. The club went completely silent. Even the phonograph seemed to quiet, though that was probably just how witnesses remembered it later. Johnson looked at the empty glass. Then he looked at Hogan. Then he did something that made the tension in that room almost unbearable. He smiled. "You should leave Harlem tonight," Johnson said quietly. "All 7 of you. You should get in whatever car you came in, drive back to wherever you think is safe, and you should not come back to any street north of 110th for a very long time." Hogan laughed again. "Or what? You going to shoot us right here? In front of all these witnesses? You going to start a war you can't finish?" "No," Johnson said, still smiling that strange, cold smile. "I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to sit here and finish my evening. But I want you to remember this conversation in about 4 hours when you realize what you just started." Hogan spat on the floor near Johnson's table, turned, and walked out with his crew. The Lennox Club remained silent for a full minute after they left. Then Johnson stood up, straightened his tie, and said something to Illinois Gordon that only the men at his table could hear. What happened in the next 12 hours would leave 11 men dead, create a political crisis that reached the mayor's office, and fundamentally reshape the power structure of organized crime in New York City. But here's the part that still confuses historians who study this period. Not a single one of those 11 deaths could be definitively traced back to Bumpy Johnson. No witnesses placed him at any crime scene. No physical evidence connected him to any violence. He never left the Lennox Club that entire night. And yet, everyone who knew what happened understood exactly who orchestrated it. How does a man engineer the most violent night in a neighborhood's history without leaving his chair? How does reputation become a weapon more deadly than any gun? And why did the New York Police Department, the mayor's office, and 3 different mob families all decide, independently, that the best response to that night's violence was to pretend it never happened? The answer reveals something about power in Depression-era America that most history books prefer not to discuss. To understand what happened after Hogan walked out of that club, you need to understand what Harlem was in September 1938 and why it occupied such a strange position in New York's criminal ecosystem. Harlem in the late 1930s was home to approximately 275,000 people, roughly 70% of whom were African American. It had become the cultural capital of Black America, the birthplace of the Harlem Renaissance, home to the Apollo Theater, the Cotton Club, and some of the most vibrant jazz culture in the world. Langston Hughes lived there. Duke Ellington performed there. It was art, music, literature, and creativity packed into a few square miles of Manhattan. It was also desperately poor. The Great Depression hit Harlem harder than almost any other neighborhood in New York. Unemployment among Black Harlemites reached 50% by 1935. The average family income was less than $1,000 a year. Overcrowding was epidemic. Families of 6 or 7 crammed into one-room apartments. The police largely ignored street crime unless it spilled into white neighborhoods, and city services were sporadic at best. Into this economic vacuum came the numbers racket. The numbers game was simple. People bet small amounts, nickels, dimes, quarters, on a 3-digit number derived from published financial statistics or horse racing results. The odds of winning were roughly 1,000 to 1, but it paid out 600 to 1, giving the house a massive edge. For Harlem residents with no other access to financial opportunity, it was hope in numerical form. By 1938, the numbers racket in Harlem generated an estimated $20 million annually. That's roughly $400 million in 2024 dollars, flowing through a neighborhood where the legitimate economy had collapsed. And until recently, it had been controlled almost entirely by white gangsters. Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, had taken over Harlem's numbers in the early 1930s through a combination of violence, political connections, and ruthless business sense. He'd pushed out independent Black operators like Stephanie St. Clair, forcing them into subordinate positions or out of the business entirely. He'd used his connections to Tammany Hall politicians and corrupt cops to protect his operations while crushing competition. But Schultz was murdered on October 23, 1935, shot in the bathroom of a Newark restaurant by Murder Incorporated, allegedly on orders from a commission. The board of directors for organized crime that included Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and other top mobsters. The official reason was that Schultz wanted to kill prosecutor Thomas Dewey, and the commission feared that murdering a public official would bring too much heat. With Schultz dead, Harlem's numbers racket entered a chaotic transition period. His organization fractured. The Italian mobs in Manhattan, primarily the Luciano family and what would become the Genovese family, inherited parts of the operation. But they faced a problem. They were white operators trying to run a business in a Black neighborhood that increasingly resented white control. This is where Bumpy Johnson entered the picture as more than just an enforcer. Johnson had been released from Sing Sing in 1934 and had spent the next 4 years carefully building a power base. He worked with Stephanie St. Clair to reclaim some of the numbers territory Schultz had taken. He cultivated relationships with Italian mobsters, particularly Vito Genovese and Lucky Luciano, positioning himself not as a competitor, but as someone who could manage Harlem operations more efficiently than white gangsters. His pitch was elegant. Harlem residents would accept the numbers racket more readily from black operators. Johnson could maintain order in the neighborhood with less violence because he understood the culture and community. He would still kick up money to the Italian families, but he would handle day-to-day operations. By 1938, this arrangement was increasingly accepted by the major Italian families. Johnson wasn't independent. No black gangster could be in that era's racial structure, but he had genuine operational authority. However, remnants of Schultz's Irish crew didn't accept this new arrangement. Men like Mickey Hogan saw Harlem as territory they'd conquered, and they viewed Johnson's rise as both a racial insult and a business threat. This tension had been building for 3 years. There had been small skirmishes, territorial disputes, verbal confrontations. But both sides had avoided open warfare because war was expensive, drew police attention, and risked intervention from the Italian families who wanted stability. Until that Friday night at the Lennox Club. Hogan's public challenge wasn't just disrespect. It was a test. He was betting that Johnson couldn't respond with the kind of overwhelming force necessary to maintain his reputation. He was betting that the Italian families wouldn't back a black operator against white gangsters in a full conflict. He was wrong. Friday night, September 23rd, 10:47 p.m. 11 minutes after Hogan left the Lennox Club, a man named Raymond Ray Hawkins walked into Small's Paradise, a famous jazz club on 135th Street and 7th Avenue. Ray was a numbers runner who worked 6 blocks in the 130s, collecting bets and delivering payouts. He was 31 years old, married, father of 2, and by all accounts a quiet man who minded his business. He was also one of 43 people who received a message in the next 30 minutes. According to police reports filed later, Ray spoke briefly with the bartender at Small's Paradise, a man named Julius Carter. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Carter later told investigators he didn't recall the specific content of what Ray said, but immediately after the conversation, Carter made a phone call from the club's back office. Within the hour, similar conversations happened at 17 different locations across Harlem: jazz clubs, restaurants, barbershops, pool halls, and speakeasies. Each conversation was brief. Each resulted in a phone call. None of the participants would later provide detailed statements to police. What investigators pieced together afterward suggested a communications network that moved information through Harlem faster than the police radio system. At 11:15 p.m., Mickey Hogan and his 6 companions were in a bar called Finnegan's on 116th Street, technically just outside Harlem, but close enough to the border that it served as neutral territory. They were celebrating Hogan's confrontation with Johnson, drinking and laughing about the look on the uppity gangster's face. What they didn't notice was the 3 men who entered separately over 15 minutes, ordered drinks, and positioned themselves at different points around the bar. One was Samuel Black Sam Jenkins, an enforcer who'd worked with Johnson since 1935. Another was Curtis Boyd, known for his skill with knives. The third was a man named William Bill Lawson, who'd done time with Johnson at Sing Sing and owed him multiple favors. They didn't approach Hogan's group. They didn't threaten anyone. They simply watched, memorizing faces, noting who was carrying weapons, observing escape routes and patterns of movement. At 11:40 p.m., all 3 left Finnegan's separately. By midnight, detailed information about Hogan's location, security, and immediate plans had reached 5 different locations in Harlem. Meanwhile, something else was happening, something quieter but ultimately more important. Phone calls were being made to specific NYPD officers in the 28th and 32nd precincts, the precincts covering Harlem. The content of these calls remains unknown, but their effect was documented in precinct logs. Between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., 7 patrol cars that normally worked Harlem routes were reassigned to other duties. 3 officers called in sick. The night desk sergeant at the 28th precinct, a man named Patrick O'Malley, who had gambling debts to the numbers operation, told the remaining patrol units to focus on the southern boundary of their district. For approximately 3 hours, much of central Harlem would have significantly reduced police presence. This wasn't random. This was engineered. At 12:15 a.m., a car pulled up outside of Brownstone on 141st Street, where Red Doyle, one of Hogan's crew, kept a room. 3 men knocked on the door. When Doyle answered, they didn't shoot him. They didn't stab him. They simply told him that he had 1 hour to be on a train out of New York, or what happened next was his own choice. Doyle, according to a statement given 3 days later to police in Boston where he'd fled, said the men were calm, polite, and absolutely terrifying. He packed a bag and was on a train to Massachusetts by 1:30 a.m. 1 down, 6 to go. Saturday morning, September 24th, 1:23 a.m. Tommy Flanagan was walking to his car on 119th Street, having left Finnegan's alone because he lived in the Bronx and had an early morning ahead. He was 34 years old, veteran of Schultz's organization, a man who'd survived the violent 1930s through a combination of street smarts and knowing when to keep his head down. He never made it to his car. According to the police report filed by Detective Lawrence Mitchell of the NYPD Homicide Division, Flanagan's body was found at 4:15 a.m. by a milk delivery driver. He'd been beaten to death in an alley between 2 buildings. No witnesses came forward. No murder weapon was found, though the coroner determined the injuries were consistent with a lead pipe or similar blunt instrument. The interesting detail, and the one that Detective Mitchell noted in his report but couldn't explain, was that Flanagan's wallet was untouched. He had $247 in cash on him, the equivalent of 3 months' wages for an average worker. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution made to look like a street crime. At 1:45 a.m., James Corrigan was leaving a woman's apartment on 138th Street when he encountered 4 men in the building's stairwell. What happened next is unclear, but Corrigan's body was found the next morning in the basement of the same building. He'd been stabbed 17 times. Again, his money was untouched. Again, no witnesses. At 2:10 a.m., Eddie Sullivan, no relation to Patrick Sullivan from Hogan's crew, was shot twice in the chest while walking on Lennox Avenue near 132nd Street. 2 witnesses told police they saw Sullivan arguing with 3 or 4 colored men moments before the shooting, but couldn't provide detailed descriptions. Both witnesses later retracted their statements, claiming they'd been mistaken about what they saw. 3 dead, 4 remaining, including Mickey Hogan. But here's where the night takes a strange turn. At 2:30 a.m., Mickey Hogan received a phone call at Finnegan's bar. The bartender, an Irish immigrant named Seamus O'Brien, later told police that Hogan's face went white during the conversation. Hogan hung up, grabbed his brother Sean and the man called Brooklyn, and left immediately. The caller's identity was never determined, but investigators believed it was someone warning Hogan that his crew was being systematically eliminated. Hogan's next move showed both panic and survival instinct. He went to the police. At 3:05 a.m., Mickey Hogan, Sean Hogan, and Brooklyn walked into the 28th Precinct Station House and demanded to see the commanding officer. They told Sergeant O'Malley, the same sergeant who'd conveniently redirected patrol cars earlier, that there was a war starting in Harlem and they needed protective custody. O'Malley's response is documented in the precinct log. He told them that if they had evidence of crimes, they should file a formal complaint. If not, they should leave, as the precinct was extremely busy and couldn't provide protection based on vague threats. This was the moment when Hogan realized he'd been outmaneuvered on every level. The police weren't going to help him, either because they'd been paid off or because they simply didn't care about Irish gangsters killing each other in Harlem. His crew was scattered or dead, and somewhere out there, Bumpy Johnson was orchestrating a response that was both overwhelming and invisible. Hogan made his final decision: run. Saturday morning, September 24th, 3:47 a.m. Mickey Hogan's car, a 1937 Packard sedan, was found abandoned on the Willis Avenue Bridge connecting Manhattan to the Bronx. The engine was still running. The driver's side door was open. There was blood on the steering wheel and front seat. There was no body. Sean Hogan and Brooklyn were never seen again. Not their bodies. Not any trace of what happened to them. They simply vanished somewhere between the 28th Precinct Station House and the Willis Avenue Bridge, a distance of approximately 4 miles through the pre-dawn streets of New York. Investigators later theorized they'd been forced into another vehicle, but no witnesses ever came forward, and no evidence of their fate ever surfaced. As for Mickey Hogan himself, his story gets stranger. At 5:30 a.m., a night watchman at a warehouse in the meatpacking district of Lower Manhattan, miles from Harlem, found a man stumbling between buildings, bleeding from a head wound, disoriented and in shock. It was Mickey Hogan. He was taken to St. Vincent Hospital, where doctors treated him for a concussion, multiple contusions, and what the medical report described as injuries consistent with extended physical trauma. He was also suffering from what we would now call acute psychological distress. He was non-responsive to questions, trembling, and according to the nursing notes, appeared terrified of shadows and sudden movements. Hogan remained in the hospital for 6 days. When he was finally able to speak to police detectives, his story was both detailed and completely useless for prosecution purposes. He claimed he'd been grabbed by 8 or 9 men near the Willis Avenue Bridge. They'd forced him into a car, driven him to an unknown location, and beaten him for what felt like hours, though he couldn't be certain of the time frame. They didn't ask him questions. They didn't make demands. They just beat him methodically while telling him that this is what happens when you disrespect power you don't understand. Then, according to Hogan, they drove him to the meatpacking district, dumped him out of the car, and one of them, Hogan couldn't describe his face, claimed the trauma had affected his memory, said, "Bumpy Johnson sends his regards. Tell every Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Polish gangster you know. Harlem belongs to Harlem now." Could Hogan identify any of his attackers? No. Could he describe the vehicle or the location where he'd been held? No. Could he provide any evidence beyond his injuries? No. The detectives who took his statement, Lawrence Mitchell and his partner Robert Chin, noted in their report that Hogan's story was consistent with extreme trauma but insufficient for criminal prosecution. They also noted that Hogan appeared more interested in leaving the city than in seeking justice. If you're still watching this deep into the story, you understand that real history is more complex than Hollywood makes it seem. These power struggles weren't about heroes and villains. They were about economics, racial dynamics, and the brutal logic of survival in Depression-era America. If you want more stories that dig into the real mechanisms of historical power, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next is where this night's violence created consequences that lasted for decades. Saturday morning, 8 a.m. Detective Lawrence Mitchell stood in the captain's office at NYPD headquarters in Lower Manhattan, looking at a map of Harlem marked with 7 different incident locations. For bodies recovered, Tommy Flanagan, James Corrigan, Eddie Sullivan, and Patrick Red Doyle, who'd been found on the train tracks outside Albany. Apparently, he hadn't made it as far from New York as he'd hoped. 3 men missing: Sean Hogan, Brooklyn, and a numbers runner named Jimmy Talbot, who'd been associated with the Irish crew and whose disappearance was reported by his wife that morning. 1 survivor in the hospital, Mickey Hogan, barely coherent and already making plans to leave New York permanently. And 0 witnesses willing to testify. 0 evidence pointing to specific perpetrators. 0 leads that would survive scrutiny in court. Captain James Donnelly, a 26-year veteran of the NYPD who'd seen Prohibition, the rise of organized crime, and the corruption that came with it, asked Mitchell the question that would define how the department handled what newspapers would soon call the Harlem Massacre. "Do you have any evidence linking Bumpy Johnson to any of these crimes?" Mitchell hesitated. Then he told the truth. "No, sir. Johnson was at the Lennox Club all night. We have 14 witnesses who place him there from 9 p.m. until 5 a.m. He didn't leave. He didn't make phone calls that we can prove. Technically, he has the best alibi in New York. Then what do you think happened? Donnelly asked. Mitchell took a breath. I think Johnson orchestrated the whole thing. I think he has a network we don't fully understand, runners, enforcers, contacts in our own department. I think he sent a message last night that's going to change the power structure in Harlem. But I also think we'll never prove it. Donnelly nodded. Then he said something that appears in Mitchell's private notes, which were donated to the New York City Municipal Archives in 1982, long after both men had retired. Then here's what we're going to do. Nothing. We're going to write up the deaths as gang-related violence. We're going to note that the victims were known criminals with enemies. We're going to make the paperwork so boring and routine that no reporter will want to dig into it. And we're going to let Harlem sort out its own power structure. Mitchell was shocked. Sir, we're talking about 7 people killed or missing in one night. We're talking about criminals killing criminals, Donnelly interrupted. We're talking about an Irish gang that tried to hold on a territory they stole from black operators, and a black operator who took it back. You want me to start a war in Harlem over that? You want me to mobilize resources to protect gangsters from other gangsters? It's still murder. It's politics, Donnelly said flatly. And here's the political reality. The city doesn't have money to fight gang wars. The mayor doesn't want another scandal. The Italian families who actually run organized crime in this city have apparently decided they can work with Johnson, which means if we go after him, we're starting a conflict with people who have judges, lawyers, and city councilmen in their pockets. So unless you've got evidence, real, courtroom-ready evidence, we're calling this case closed. Mitchell started to argue, then stopped. He realized that Donnelly wasn't condoning murder. He was acknowledging a reality that the NYPD faced in 1938. They were undermanned, underfunded, and operating in a city where organized crime had more political connections than the police did. The case was officially closed on October 3rd, 1938, listed as gang-related violence, insufficient evidence for prosecution. But the real story of what happened that morning was unfolding in rooms far from police headquarters. The aftermath of that September night rippled through New York's underworld like a seismic wave, reshaping power structures that had been in place for years. First, and most immediately, every remaining member of Dutch Schultz's Irish crew left Harlem. Some, like Mickey Hogan, left New York entirely. Others shifted to operations in the Bronx or Brooklyn. Within 3 weeks, Irish control of any number's territory north of 110th Street had completely evaporated. Second, the Italian families, specifically the Luciano family and the emerging Genovese family, formalized their arrangement with Bumpy Johnson. According to FBI surveillance reports from the period, declassified in the 1990s under FOIA requests, Johnson met with Vito Genovese in late October 1938. The details of that meeting are unknown, but its effects were clear. Johnson was given operational control of Harlem's numbers racket, reporting to and sharing profits with the Italian families, but managing day-to-day operations independently. This arrangement was unprecedented. No black gangster in America had ever held this level of autonomous authority in organized crime. Johnson wasn't an equal to the Italian bosses. The racial structure of 1930s America made that impossible, but he was more than a subordinate. He was something new, a regional power broker with genuine authority. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the violence of that September night became a reputation that Johnson would leverage for the next 30 years. He demonstrated something that changed how other criminals viewed him. He could organize overwhelming force, execute it with precision, and avoid legal consequences. The legend of Harlem's Bloodiest night grew in the telling. Some versions had Johnson personally killing Mickey Hogan. Some claimed 20 men died instead of 7. Some said Johnson used voodoo or had supernatural powers. Johnson never corrected these stories. He understood that reputation could be more valuable than reality, and that fear based on uncertainty was more effective than fear based on known capabilities. Malcolm X, who arrived in Harlem in the early 1940s and got to know Johnson, later wrote about this in his autobiography. He described Johnson as a man who understood that the most dangerous thing about him wasn't what he'd done, but what people believed he might do. The September violence also had an unexpected effect on Harlem itself. With Irish gangsters gone and Johnson managing the numbers racket more carefully, violence in the neighborhood actually decreased. Johnson enforced a strict code: no violence against civilians, no operating near schools or churches, no police attention that would threaten the larger operation. This wasn't altruism, it was business. But the result was that many Harlem residents viewed Johnson with a complicated mixture of fear and respect. He was a criminal, yes, but he was their criminal, and under his management, Harlem's underworld became paradoxically more stable. The political establishment took notice too. By 1939, Johnson was being consulted, unofficially and always through intermediaries, about Harlem issues by Tammany Hall politicians who needed to understand a neighborhood's power structures. He became what we might now call a community power broker, though that term didn't exist in 1930s vocabulary. And what about the police? Detective Mitchell never forgot that September night, but he also never got the evidence to prosecute Johnson for it. He retired in 1956, and in his later years, he gave several interviews to researchers about organized crime in New York. About Johnson, he said, "He was the smartest criminal I ever investigated. Not because he was violent. Lots of criminals are violent. Because he understood systems. He knew how power worked at every level: street, precinct, city hall, and the criminal organizations. And he knew that if you controlled enough of those levels, you could operate in plain sight and be untouchable." As for Mickey Hogan, he lived until 1967, dying of liver disease in a small town in Pennsylvania. In his final years, he told his family members very little about his criminal past, but he was known to have nightmares and to avoid any mention of Harlem. His grandson, who gave an interview to a true crime podcast in 2019, said that Hogan kept a photograph of Bumpy Johnson in a drawer, and that late in life, when his mind was failing, he would sometimes look at it and say he was right. "I should have left when he told me to." Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, at the age of 62, of congestive heart failure. He collapsed in a Harlem restaurant, surrounded by friends, still dressed impeccably, still commanding respect. His funeral was attended by thousands, criminals and community members, jazz musicians and politicians, people who feared him and people who admired him. Frank Lucas, who would later become a major heroin dealer and the subject of the film American Gangster, was among the mourners. So were multiple NYPD detectives who'd spent decades trying to build cases against Johnson and had never quite succeeded. In the eulogies and obituaries, the events of September 23rd, 1938, were mentioned obliquely. The New York Times called it a night of violence that established Johnson's dominance in Harlem's underworld. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's major black newspaper, described it as the night when Harlem's power shifted from white control to black management. Neither mentioned the specific deaths. Neither named Mickey Hogan. Neither described the systematic elimination of a rival gang in less than 6 hours. Because by 1968, what had happened that night wasn't really about the violence anymore. It was about what the violence represented, a moment when the racial and economic power structures of American organized crime began to shift. Johnson had proven that a black gangster could not only survive but thrive in a world previously controlled by white ethnics. He'd shown that intelligence, organization, and understanding of political systems could be more valuable than simple violence. He demonstrated that power wasn't just about who could kill whom. It was about who could mobilize resources, control territory, manage relationships, and avoid consequences. The night at the Lennox Club wasn't just about 7 Irish gangsters who made a fatal mistake. It was about the end of one era in American crime and the beginning of another. For researchers and historians, the September 23rd violence remains a case study in organized criminal strategy. It demonstrates principles of power consolidation that apply far beyond the criminal underworld. The importance of reputation, the value of networks, the strategic use of force, and the necessity of understanding both formal and informal power structures. It also reveals uncomfortable truths about law enforcement in 1930s America. The NYPD's decision not to aggressively pursue the case reflected both resource limitations and political calculations. They were willing to let criminals kill each other as long as civilian casualties were minimized and the violence didn't spread beyond acceptable boundaries. This selective enforcement created the space where someone like Johnson could operate, not because police were stupid or universally corrupt, but because they made practical decisions about which crimes to prioritize in a city with more crime than they could possibly address. For the Harlem community, Johnson's victory that night was complicated. He was a criminal who profited from gambling that drained money from poor neighborhoods. But he was also a black man who'd taken power from white gangsters and demonstrated that black organizational skill could compete at the highest levels of the underworld. This duality, criminal and community figure, destroyer and protector, would define how Johnson was remembered long after his death. The Lennox Club, where this all began, operated until 1952 when it was shut down in a police raid. The building still stands on 145th Street, now converted to apartments. There's no historical marker, no plaque commemorating what happened there. But in certain circles, among people who study organized crime, among older Harlemites who remember the stories their grandparents told, among researchers fascinated by the hidden power structures of American cities, September 23, 1938, remains significant. It was the night 7 men laughed at the wrong person's power and learned too late that power isn't always visible until it's already destroyed you. It was the night Harlem's underworld became, in practice if not in theory, controlled by someone who understood the neighborhood in ways outsiders never could. It was the night violence served not as chaos, but as communication, a message sent in blood that would be heard clearly by every gangster in New York. The old rules were changing, and those who didn't adapt wouldn't survive. And it was the night Bumpy Johnson sat in the Lennox Club from 9 p.m. until 5 a.m., drinking whiskey, listening to jazz, and never making a single phone call that could be traced or proven, while the city around him transformed according to plans he'd set in motion, with a quiet warning that nobody had taken seriously enough. "You should leave Harlem tonight," he'd told Mickey Hogan. Hogan should have listened. 7 men didn't listen. 7 men died or disappeared. And the power structure of organized crime in America's most famous black neighborhood changed forever. That's the real story of Harlem's bloodiest night. Not the violence itself, but what the violence accomplished and the system of power it revealed. A system where the most dangerous man in the room was often the one who never needed to raise his voice, because he'd already organized everything necessary to destroy you before you even knew you were at risk. That was Bumpy Johnson's genius. That was his legacy. And that September night in 1938 was when everyone in New York's underworld learned that lesson permanently. The hard way.